Just listen to this build. That sweet lightning shotgun thundercrack. Oh, hello my fellow sorcerers, and welcome one, welcome all, as I bring you a brand new build that combines both Frozen Orb and Charged Bolts to give you this icy blast that obliterates everything in front of you, and it is so unbelievably satisfying, and it looks fantastic seeing the exploding ice on top of the exploding lightning just careening all over the screen. The flow we get here is the ability to just spam teleport round the map, making enemies constantly stunned, frozen and vulnerable, even at range not needing Frost Nova, which is awesome, while having infinite mana and being nigh impossible to kill, as you one-shot everything that isn't an especially tanky elite or, of course, boss. This really is a lovely dance of two elements made possible and inspired by the recent patch that buffed both Frozen Orb and Charged Bolts. Both have just got stronger, and both work, as it turns out, so well together. So, how is this actually all achieved, and what literally is happening? Let's get into this and explore the world of Frozen Shotgun Sorcerer. As is tradition then, we begin with the skill tree. 2 ranks into Firebolt, both to get to the core skills, but also because of course we will be using it as one of our enchantment slots, as well we have no choice if we want to do any kind of meaningful damage and not die. Oh, when will we get a 3rd enchantment slot or some kind of change to address that sorcerers? Woo! Anyway, we could still have a load of fun, so we've got that going for us. And that fun begins with 5 ranks in Frozen Orb as our 2nd enchantment slot, and we'll go over that in more detail in but a moment. Grab Enhanced, so we can then get to Greater, so it constantly makes enemies vulnerable at range. This is really useful, as the way we're set up with certain bits of gear means that we will consistently have pre-prepped vulnerable enemies in the distance to teleport onto. Then we get extra mana, as we want to be above 100 mana, casting our Charged Bolts as often as possible for the crit aspect, and then Charged Bolts as the main spammy spender shotgun blaster of the build. All 5 ranks, and then enhance it for the, main shotgun effect, this Nova, as it cleaves through enemies, and then Greater, so we do extra damage to stunned enemies, which of course works perfectly with Raiment of the Infinite, Teleport, Group, Blast, Shock, Nova, everyone dies. Then our defensives, all 4 as is very much expected. Flame Shield to the emergency heal button, and teleport to shimmering, so we can keep that damage reduction rolling. We want to grab all of the glass cannon for the extra free damage. This build especially is very tanky thanks to the ice infusion that we'll see once we get to the Paragon board, and just 1 rank in elemental attunement. This will happen often enough that we don't need to waste 2 points to get the other 2 ranks. Then Ice Armor for some extra survivability and some more barrier uptime, and then our source of vulnerable in Frost Nova with both enhanced and then mystical for said vulnerable. Teleporting on enemies, Frost Novaing them, and then Charged Bolt exploding them while Frozen Orb stacks on top. It really is delightful. Extra lucky hit, as this will power our mana regen engine, and then we want both of Mana Shield for constantly active damage reduction and protection for a different kind of constantly active damage reduction. Then we shimmy on down to get the ever-present Devouring Blaze. This is especially good here as this is a very heavy crit-focused build, and the damage bump, as I'm sure you're beyond aware at this point, is too big to ignore. Then we get a little bit of the frost passives, just one in permafrost to get to Hoarfrost, so we do 18% increased damage to frozen enemies. We'll be freezing enemies a lot. This is a nice increase. Then we still do get Unstable Currents, just as our cooldown of choice here, so we can mainly have 10 seconds of super fast attack speed, which means more charged bolts, more shotgun blasts per second, which is a huge bump to our output. One rank, of course, in Currents, we don't need the extra crit help just to get to Electrocution for some more tankiness. And then, as this is a super close range power build that doesn't use crackling energy, Via's Mastery is the way to go, both for the extra damage, but also for the extra damage reduction. So that's the skill tree, a fairly straightforward setup. Talking of fairly straightforward setup, well, you can see it right here. Essentially very similar to Lash, but we will just be spamming out our charged bolts and sending free frozen orbs along too, as we stack up so many different forms of damage. So our enchantments then are, as I said, firebolts, just so enemies are burning and we get all of the goodness that entails, but more specifically then is Frozen Orb. At a baseline, 20% chance for anything we do, because we're not using a basic skill, so anything, to throw out a free Frozen Orb. This is really, really potent, and it adds up. So on average, 1 out of every 5 charged bolts will throw out, yes, a free Frozen Orb. The damage this adds just on a pure extra numbers applied to enemies basis is really, really decent, but it also pulses really quickly, kind of like the ice version of Ball Lightning. So this means it is activating our Lucky Hit effects so often, and as Lucky Hit is a big reason why we don't run out of mana, i.e. Lucky Hit, primary resource, regen, this really contributes to that. But beyond that then, when this does hit a frozen enemy, it makes them vulnerable. Now you might think that's a waste because our freeze makes them vulnerable anyway, but we will be freezing enemies in an extra way that then when we send a free extra frozen orb at them, it will make them vulnerable. Now we can jump on them and just start hitting them, and we don't have to use a Frost Nova, so we get much more free Frost Nova usage throughout the dungeon. But it also should be noted that the Frozen Orb cast by the enchantment has a little bit of a different way of working. When you throw out your own Frozen Orb, it will just travel and travel and travel until it reaches max distance, and then it will detonate. Whereas the enchantment one that goes out deliberately targets an enemy that is close by, and let's say the enemy that was close by is right next to me, it will actually stop on them and do damage right there. It won't continue all the way past them. That means that we lose one of the main annoyances of using Frozen Orb as a main skill. That being the fact that enemies just constantly move through and away from it, and it just keeps traveling past them. So, for example, if I was here and I do that, the Frozen Orb just goes straight past them and sadly doesn't kill them. Whereas if I do that, you see how it stopped right there on top of the enemy because it was the free enchantment cast? That is very, very worthwhile and very noticeable. If I can get it to happen again, as there we go, you see it stops when it reaches the target, where the one that we cast doesn't and goes straight past the target. This makes the enchantment of Frozen Orb better Frozen Orb than literally the Frozen Orb you put on the bars and cast yourself. I think that's a bit silly, but it is what it is, and we take advantage of that little interaction here. So in essence, piloting this build is fairly simple. Dive on a group of enemies, freeze them, and then just explode them with charged bolts. Frozen Orbs will stack up on top of them too, pulsing for extra damage, allowing you to tap into those frozen and chill synergies, as well as giving greater uptime to vulnerability and reliability of it too. The Unstable Currents is just there as a actual full-on cooldown. If you're doing a boss or hard pack of elites, you want to carefully choose when you need the extra oomph from it. Other than that, it's sort of business as usual. Let's go over then our legendary aspects. On our weapon, we have the Frozen Orb aspect. This is what causes it to actually stay on the spot when it gets to the target enemy and keep pulsing damage, triggering lucky hits, and doing all the goodness we want it to do. This is mandatory, and you want, of course, good of its role as possible. I've got minimum, but it still does the job. On your offhand, and you do very much want Wand and Focus for the innate cooldown reduction, lucky hit chance, and attack speed, you want extra crit chance when you cast a core spell above your 100 mana threshold. We comfortably sit at 140 mana, and Charged Bolts is only 21, which means we get 2 casts off before we even have to regen to get the effect back. You can see how hard it is for us to run out of mana, and that's without enemies to actually hit to get the restore of it. Then continuing on to our ring, we do have prodigies just to help the top up keep rolling as we mow through enemies. Sometimes you might find yourself running a little bit low. This ensures that that will never actually happen as we're constantly using our cooldowns. I do think you could get away this being another damaging aspect, but I wanted to be on the safe side. Then we have critical strikes with your core skills accelerating, give you extra attack speed. This is really useful, as if we were just casting it this fast, it would feel a little bit anticlimactic, but once this kicks in, which is always because we're constantly critting, you really notice the pickup. Then we get the ever faithful control. We will be freezing constantly, we will be stunning constantly. This is just a huge stacking damage increase. On our helm, we want Frost Blitz, so we can do 2 Frost Novas, maintain as much freeze and vulnerability uptime as possible. Raiment of the Infinite, as it is just bonkers good, as you all very much know if you're playing Sorcerer, and if you don't have one yet, I hope that happens soon for you. Then one really nice little addition here, and what really brings this all together. If you don't have Frostburn, it's not the end of the world. You can just put on any gloves that also have chance to restore resource, but this really gives it a kick. Because we now have a lucky hit chance to freeze enemies, this is what is consistently freezing just everything, even when Frost Nova is on cooldown or without us using it. If our Frozen Orb flies off into the distance, triggers this lucky hit, it now freezes them, and because it's Frozen Orb, that means it now instantly applies vulnerable to them. So Frostburn rolling that lucky hit freeze means that everywhere around us we are very reliably freezing and vulnerable, and then obviously triggering control and all of our CC damage amps, and it really works. In fact, I was kind of having a little bit of a struggle making this flow in a way that felt good to present to you guys, and Frostburn really was like a magic key that unlocked this build. That said, another magic key was a shift to the Paragon board, which is why I think it will still work even if you don't have Frostburn, but it is highly recommended. Then we have Disobedience on our legs, just to, stay alive. And then finally, we want extra lucky hit chance with Barrier on our boots, so that we can trigger our resource regen as often as we can, alongside triggering the freeze as often as we can. In your gem slots, you want crit damage to vulnerable, you want rubies for your health, and you want skulls for your armor. When it comes to what affixes and stats you're looking to roll here, well, it is fairly straightforward. You want mana cost reduction, then you want cooldown reduction, then you want resource generation, then you want lucky hit, either pure or with barrier, then you want attack speed, then you want crit chance, then you want crit damage, and after that, just general damage to close, extra lightning damage, all of that, intelligence, and so on and such forth. The kind of bonus, and of course ranks to your defensive skills and Devouring Blaze. Then when we look at kind of general thresholds, you want your crit chance to at least be above 30%, as high a crit damage as you can get, and then when we get all the way down here, you want your cooldown reduction again as high as you can get, at least 30. You want at least a 40% lucky hit chance, so I really want a bit more here, though once the barrier comes up, it does do quite well. And then you want this mana generation to be potently high thanks to having the extra resource generation and then at least 30% mana cost reduction with as much max mana as you can get to, as that's another quality of fix. Before we round things out with the Paragon board then, I do want to answer a question I imagine you either have had in your head this entire time, or perhaps have already asked in the comments. And that question is, hey, we're using Charged Bolts as a main build powerer here. Why aren't we using the unique staff that affects Charged Bolts? Well, that is a great question. And the answer, ultimately and honestly, unfortunately, is simply that it's just not good. And the reason No Lam Esan isn't good is A, even with the buff to it, the damage loss to gain piercing actually means that we're not gaining damage from it piercing. You see, the main source of damage when it comes to charged bolts is not the actual bolts themselves, but this Nova Blast of lightning that will constantly happen as you spam it out. Now, yes, the piercing does mean that that can happen multiple times, but again, at the cost of being 25% weaker, which almost cancels it out. Now, if it was just that, it might still be worth using. But, because it's a two-handed staff, yes, it hits hard, and yes, it still has the lucky hit resource, but it attacks too slowly compared to a wand and focus. On top of that, the wand has inherent lucky hit chance, which we really need, and the focus has inherent cooldown reduction, which we really need. So we just lose too much to actually put this unique effect on, which really, really sucks. Now, there is a fun way to use this, but it doesn't exactly make a build, but it's really a shame to have this be the result of all of my testing. If you do use the staff, then to answer perhaps your other question, you do want to then use charged bolts lasting longer and being attracted to enemies. But as with the staff, the reason we don't need or want to use this in this build with a charged bolt spamming build is because, again, the damage is from here. And as the charged bolts are consumed, well, there's nothing to last longer and keep going without them piercing. And if you miss, well, yeah, that might mean they turn around and they then actually hit something, but you shouldn't really be missing at point blank range after raimenting anyway. And finally, one very little known fact is that this aspect, even though it doesn't say, increases the mana cost of charged bolts. So I've taken my necklace off, which has mana cost reduction, so it doesn't muddy the results. We have 28 mana cost. We put on this, which has the aspect, and now we have 34. It adds 6 to the cost of charged bolts, which simply just isn't worth it. Paragon board it is then. As always, follow my path through it, and in our first glyph slot, you want destruction. Extra crit damage from your core skills, we are using 2 of them. This is a hefty bonus, and then just the general damage increase from critting is really nice too. We are firing out so many charged bolts, so many ticks of orb, that we just crit constantly. Then we get the customary Burning Instinct board for all of our flaming synergy. You want this cluster here. I'm missing this one because I ran out of Paragon points and had a more important place to put it, but you do want to grab it, and grab the 2 rares too. Then the glyph here is territorial for that damage reduction from close and the increased damage to close, and yes, get the bonus so it's active, but again, I had to use my points more importantly later down the board. I will put this back in as I get the next couple. Then we get the vulnerable Frigid Fate board. Head firstly down here to get all of this delicious vulnerable damage, then get the glyph, which is going to be Tactician, to A, give us a permanent 10% damage increase as we use a defensive skill more often than once every 4 seconds anyway, and to amp this weakness node here for as much vulnerable damage as humanly possible, as this build is applying it all the time. If you're you're higher level than me and have spare points, then go up and grab Frigid Fate. Extra lucky hit chance for extra mana restore is not a bad thing, but it's not a priority. Then we go straight down and get the Static Surge board so that we refill our mana fully every single time we teleport onto a group of enemies. This is glorious and really eliminates any remaining mana issues we might have. But before we get to it, you want to veer right in this rotation and get the extra mana nodes here alongside the extra damage to stunned enemies. Then we get the glyph slot, and in the glyph slot we want control for more damage to frozen and stunned, which is what this build does all the time. Grab Incapacitate 2, and then go down, get the legendary node, and get this final cluster here for even more damage to stunned enemies and elites. Then we move over to our next board, which is Icefall. This is what gives this build some serious tankiness to it, and we want to make a beeline for it via this extra cold damage, which will amp our Frozen Orb, and it really is noticeable. This orientation, and get your Icefall. Then you want to head up here to get the damage reduction from Chilled as a little way to take the edge off from anything that's been hit by the Frozen Orb, but eventually you will make your way past here, get your extra damage to Chilled enemies, again playing off the Frozen Orb, arriving here, more damage reduction, more damage to Chilled. This is the extra, I've just got so many Paragon points, I'm super high level board past getting this key node. And in this glyph socket here, you would want to put yourself Exploit for even more vulnerable damage. So, that's kind of that then when it comes to my Orb Frozen Shocked Blast Shotgun. What was that name? Orb Frozen Shocked Blast Shotgun? That was so terrible. When it comes to my Frozen Shotgun, there, that's nicer, yeah, woo! It really is enjoyable. It's fun to see the Frozen Orb fly off at a chosen enemy, follow it in with a teleport, and then start thundercracking with charged bolts. Everything melts, and it's a really fast, effective speed clearing and farming build. Again, it's not going to top Arc Lash or Ice Shards, and it's not going to let you push really high keys because there is just better builds for that, but in terms of just pure efficiency, pushing moderate keys and just getting stuff done in the end game, this really does work, and it's a different flavor of Sorcerer, which I think is always welcome. We still do need more buffs though, and a lot of mechanical fixes, but that's for another day. For now then, like if you enjoyed this, subscribe and hit the bell for more. Consider supporting the future of the channel on Patreon down below, and until we meet again, a good
Josh, Cotton, and Hollow with the videos, dropping the humor like a hammer on your tippy toes, bringing entertainment on a daily arrangement to take our insanity and turn it into entertainment. Yes, I said entertainment twice, to reiterate that it is nice to look into your faces on a mostly daily basis when you let us in your homes to make the whole world a stage. Goodbye.